I graduated from State High in 2005, so I'm an actual townie. But I decided I didn't want to stay here and go to Penn State. So I went to Bucknell, which is an hour and 15 minutes to the east of here. It's a small liberal arts school that has a lot of really lovely programs. And I originally went because I thought that I would be a biology major and pursue a degree towards the veterinary sciences. I wanted to be a large animal veterinarian. After my first semester at Bucknell, I realized very quickly that I didn't really want to do that because there's a lot of science and a lot of math in veterinary medicine. And I was much more inclined towards history and the arts. And so I ended up taking 2 classes, one in classical studies and one in religious studies in that first semester, and I fell in love with them. They were my favorite classes. I did phenomenally well in them. And I decided in my sophomore year that I was going to become a double major in classical history, which is the study of ancient Greece, ancient Rome, ancient Egypt, and religious studies, which my religious studies degree was very broad. Catholicism, Judaism, Buddhism, Hinduism, alternative religious movements was one of my classes. And so those things really helped to form my academic career. I also minored in art history and in dance, but the dance one was just kind of for fun. So when I graduated in 2009, I had absolutely no idea what I was going to do with any of these degrees. I hadn't had a class to introduce me to the different jobs that I would be able to pursue. But I did know that one of my professors was an archaeologist, and I thought that sounded really cool. I also knew that I loved going to museums, and so the idea of being a museum person sounded really cool. And I decided that I would take a gap year and explore both of those alternatives so that when I applied for a graduate program, I knew which one I wanted to do. And so the summer after I graduated, I took my first step towards trying to decide, and I went on a dig in Bulgaria for a month, which was an amazing experience. I would highly recommend. If you ever get the opportunity to go on an archaeological dig, even if it's just local to where you are, definitely do it. And while I was on this dig, I learned the ins and outs of what it actually is to be an archaeologist. And archaeologists do a lot more math and science than you would think. They do a lot of measuring, they do a lot of sampling of soils, they do a lot of understanding gradients of different levels of the soil, and they also do a lot more art than you would anticipate, because you need to draw and you need to photograph and you need to do all of these intricate just designs to map out your different plots. And so I realized that there was a lot that goes into being an archaeologist that I didn't particularly enjoy. However, while I was on that dig, I also had the opportunity to process the finds that we were coming up with during our dig at the local museum. And that was where I realized this is the kind of stuff that I'm interested in. It's very hands-on, very tactile, and so I was cleaning pottery sherds, and I was scrubbing off old coins, and I was labeling them with liquid label, which is kind of like a nail polish, but it's reversible, so you can take it off with acetone, which is a kind of like a nail polish remover. So these are things that I learned while I was there, and that's the kind of science that I could handle, very limited. And so I decided when I got home that I wanted to apply to universities that had museum studies programs. I applied for several that following fall, but I decided that I wanted to keep an academic frame of mind while I was in that year before I found out what school I was going to be able to get into and where I was going to eventually go. So I had moved home, I was back in State College, and I decided to take, I decided to audit Latin for fun, because obviously, why wouldn't you audit Latin for fun? And so I spent 2 semesters taking Latin here at Penn State, and they were lovely. I enjoyed it. I do believe very much that it helped me keep that academic frame of mind that I needed, so that when I started my master's program that following fall, I was still ready to go. I was still feeling like I was a student. Luckily for me, when I applied to the several universities that I did, I got into my number one choice, which was Johns Hopkins University. And the thing about the Johns Hopkins program, even though it was new, was that it was 100% online. And I really appreciated the opportunity to be able to stay at home, live at home, save some money, continue working at my job as a dance teacher at my local studio that I had been doing. And so I jumped into the opportunity to study with Johns Hopkins. Another thing that was great about the Johns Hopkins program was that half of the professors weren't academics, they were museum professionals. They were people in the field who knew what they were doing, and it wasn't just textbook based. And so I got the opportunity to take classes on exhibition design. I was able to take classes on, ethics. I was able to take classes on, finance and like the different ways that, you operate a museum. And so I got a really well-rounded education on the different parts of museums that you need to have operating at any one time. While I was in that program, I got the opportunity to spend 2 weeks at an on-site summer seminar in London. And that was very specific to my Johns Hopkins program. So not all programs would have had that. But I got the opportunity to go behind the scenes at several of the largest museums in the world, get an idea of the kinds of things that the museum professionals are doing to put together exhibitions and to keep objects, safe for hundreds of years so that they can be available for research and they can be available for view, and that the human population will have that information forever. Also during that time, I had the opportunity to do several different internships while I was in my program. The first internship that I did was one that I sought out on my own. I reached out to a museum. They weren't advertising that they had any open internships, but I reached out to a museum in Chicago called the National Hellenic Museum. And I reached out to them because the National Hellenic Museum is the national museum of basically the Greek people of America. And with my classics degree, it helped to, for me, bridge the gap between my love of classics and my new discovery of museum studies. And I wanted to know what it was like to work in a museum that I also had an interest in the actual topic of conversation we were discussing. And so I just emailed them. They didn't have an opportunity, but I just emailed them and said that I wanted to intern for them. And they reached back out to me and they said, yeah, we can make that happen. And so I moved to Chicago for a whole summer and I interned at this museum, and it was a wonderful experience. It was the first time that I got the opportunity to actually handle collections, learn about how you properly store things, how you work with a database, all of this stuff that I never would have gotten the opportunity to learn in just a classroom setting. After coming home from that, I got the opportunity the following summer to take a temporary internship with a non-museum entity. And I cannot express how good of an experience that was. I was able to have an internship where it was only a month, it wasn't very long, but I was asked to do all of the research and planning and kind of outreach for a think tank in DC, for a history wall that they wanted to put into the new building that they were building for themselves. And so I spent a month going to different museums and experiencing their displays and kind of writing up a report as to the kinds of display techniques that are available now, or at the time, for their history of themselves display. And I never got actually the opportunity to see it in person. Maybe one day I'll make it down there and I'll be able to see what they ended up doing, but it was a really nice experience to work on my exhibition strategies, part of what would eventually become my current position. So I highly recommend that if you were to pursue a museum a pathway. You don't need to limit yourself to internships that are only with museums. You can broaden your horizons into internships that can be translated into a museum experience. My final intentional internship was through a class that I had with Johns Hopkins. I did a summer study internship with the Penn State Special Collections Library. I got credit for it from my university, and I put together a exhibition in the Special Collections Library on the Land Grant Act. And I spent the class was only supposed to be about 5 weeks, but I spent about 8 weeks on this project. And I really enjoyed it. It was nice to work with the university and with people over at Paterno. And overall, I felt very accomplished at the end of it. I put together an amazing exhibit, and it was one of those things where I really got the opportunity to experience what it is like to dive into an archive, to look up the photos and information, and then draw from a collection to put things on display and describe things for people to view. So that was the end of what I believed was my internship story. However, in the last semester of my program, one of my classes required that you interview a museum professional local to you. And in a previous class, I had interviewed someone over at the Palmer, and I decided I didn't want to interview someone at the Palmer again. So I had reached out to the All Sports Museum, and I asked the director if I could interview him and his operations manager, and he said, yeah, sure, you can come over and interview us. That would be great. And so that's what I did. I interviewed the two of them for this class, and after the interview with the director ended, he told me before I even left, if you're ever interested in having an internship with us, you just reach out. I'd love to have you. And I said to him, I will call you. And that's what I did. And so for the last semester of my master's year in 2013, I was working about 10 hours a week, just cataloging things, doing inventory, lots of very much behind the scenes activities that constitute what a museum collections manager does. And so I was able to take that internship and turn it into a pretty long period of time where unfortunately I wasn't paid for this internship. That is the main problem you're going to come across when it comes to a lot of museum positions, is that they are not paid. But there are grants, there are other kinds of funding sometimes that you can find. But since I lived locally, it wasn't a big deal for me to do this one unpaid, because all it cost me was my dad's gas money. And so I spent a couple of years doing this. And in that time period, I had graduated, I was applying for jobs. I found it very difficult to find museum positions in the local area, so I started reaching out further. And I started reaching out into areas that were not technically museum related. And in 2016, I was offered a position at a private contracting company in DC that worked with the national government. Unfortunately, that position required clearances, top security level clearances. And with the Trump administration coming in 2016, my clearances took over 18 months to come through. So I continued working at the All Sports Museum throughout that time, but I had always intended on taking this archivist job down in DC. By the time my clearances came through, however, that archival position had been filled. But I decided, it at least will take me down to DC. Maybe I'll have the opportunity to start volunteering and interning in my spare time at museums that are down in the DC area. So I took a different job, which was just a scanning job. It wasn't particularly interesting, and with the same company, and I moved down to the DC area. And for 11 months, I worked in DC, but I found that it was very difficult to also have time to integrate myself into the museum community down there. And in that time period, I had been asked by family and friends and also my boss back at the All Sports Museum to come home. That I was very much missed and I was very much needed. And so I decided that I would take that jump and I would move back home and I would take a increase in my position at the All Sports Museum. So I went from working only 10 to 15 hours a week to now being a 30-hour-a-week part-time employee. They're dedicated collections manager and registrar. And that was the position that I was in until about 2 years ago when my director left, and the new director who came in had a background in education and marketing. He did not have a background in what I do, and so I now was also taking on the added hats, so to speak, of the exhibitions and curator. And so that's the thing that you'll find with many museums, especially small and medium-sized museums, is that you will wear many hats. You will have many jobs that all fall underneath your description, even if you didn't feel that that was something you were particularly trained to do. And so when it comes to the Penn State All Sports Museum, my main jobs are collections manager, registrar, curator, and exhibition specialist. And so those are the things that I do on a day-to-day basis. The first one, collections manager, is kind of self-explanatory. I manage the collection. Any objects that are donated, any objects that are on loan, anything that's already in our collection, I'm taking care of. And I'm making sure that they are stored properly, that they are labeled properly, that I have all of the information that I need about them so that they can go on display, they can tell their stories. As the registrar part of the job is hand in hand with the collections manager part, but it's more of a database and written word part. So the registrar takes care of managing the actual database, so all of the information that I put into our system so that I know what each object is, the actual inclusion of objects into our system. So whenever we get a new object into our collection, I go through the paperwork of having the donor sign a deed of gift so that they transfer ownership of their object to the museum, and now the museum owns that object. It's very important to have that paperwork because lots of people will be like, well, I gave this basketball to the museum, but my grandson says he wants it, I want it back now. It's like, well, I'm sorry, you transferred ownership of that basketball to us and it is now ours, and your grandson can come see it. I'll be happy to pull it out for him, but he can't take it home. And so that's the kind of thing that I can do as the registrar. I can pull up information, I can tell you what the historical provenance is of an object. A provenance just being its history, its documented history. One of the more important things that I do is when we get new objects in, I accession them into the collection. And by accessioning, I just mean I enter it into our database, both manually and digitally, so that we have a record that we own that object. And so those are my main hats that I wear when it comes to the registrar. When it comes to the curator position, the curator position is almost 100% research-based. I am looking into the information, the history of every object that comes into our collection, every object that is on loan. I'm looking into the histories of the stories of objects we already have so that we can tell interesting stories through our exhibitions. I am doing as much background work into knowing about the things that we have as possible. And that helps my exhibition designer part of my job. That is the final hat that I wear. Whenever we want to put a new exhibit up, I have to do I have to take from all the other aspects of my job. I need to know what objects I have to work with, what people I need to talk to about putting, vinyl backers and putting together information placards. I need to be able to talk to families that have loaned us items for certain exhibits. Those are the kinds of things that the exhibition design aspect of my job is. It's still something that even though it was something I was taught early in my academic museum studies career, it's not something I've had to do a lot of because my previous director did that a lot. He liked it. It was one of his favorite parts of his job. But since my new director doesn't do that, a lot of that has fallen now on my shoulders, and it's been very fun to be more creative in my job. And so that's been a good addition to my my palette of job opportunities and responsibilities at the museum. So in the last 11 years that I've been with the museum, I've gotten the opportunity to do a lot, and it's been a really wonderful experience. And I would be happy to answer any questions about my position that you might have now. Oh, it was only 20 minutes, oh no.
Yeah. I think that's not necessarily a bad thing, because I think there'll be a lot of questions.
Yeah, I'm not so sure that that's bad. Like, how long was it supposed to be?
So the whole class is 50 minutes long.
Oh, okay.
And even if the students don't ask questions, I'm assuming the professor will probably try to ask you questions to get conversation going.
Yeah. I also was thinking that I might try and include more photographs during this. So there's like going to be downtime in between each one of the
When
slides,
you brought up the land grant, you didn't say it was at Penn State, so I think that
I did and I didn't, if that makes sense.
Yes.
I said it,
but that's one of
Special
the
Collections Library.
that's one of the times where I thought, putting up a picture of your
of the poster
would be
I
fantastic.
do have a picture of the poster.
I know you do.
I have the actual poster
And
as well.
and then when you get to some of the special collections, I would, some of those pictures would be kind of cool.
Yeah.
Not special collections, special exhibits like the blue band, and those would be kind of cool.
Talk about some of your favorite favorite collections you've put together.
Yeah.
One of the other things that I noted is that you did talk about the difference between your directors. You didn't mention the fact that your new director wants to have changing exhibits much more often than your old director did.
Okay.
Yep.
So, it's not that just so much that it's falling on your head more than it was falling before. It's that the fact that the new director wants to have more of them.
Right.
Where you weren't,
It's good.
he was doing, research for a year and a half to have an exhibit out for 6 months. When he did like World War One.
Well, I mean, so like the World War II exhibit's out for 3 years, and he probably did 3 years worth of research on it.
So I mean that's a very interesting thing to contemplate. How long does it take to do research for an exhibit?
Yep.
And right now you're spending a couple of weeks doing research for an exhibit that may only last a week.
Right. Yes.
Yes.
That's exactly what I'm doing.
Yeah.
I'm doing at least a week of research and design of the panels and development of the things that are going in the boxes, and then it's only going to be up for a week or two.
And not that any of that is wrong or bad or different.
It's just
It is different.
it's different. Yeah.
Well, and would you say that's the reality of
It's the reality of my job right now.
your job, but like of your position in a museum?
You have to be very flexible.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
That's the number one point, is you have to be flexible.
Yep.
And that you don't really know what's there. There was something else early on that I wanted to harp on. Oh, back to the pictures. Some of your pictures from Sagara Gazora, and the mosque church mosaics. I think those are some of the most. Those are pretty impressive.
This is why I say I think we need to have somebody to look at it a little bit.
Yep.
Because it does it all the time.
Okay.
Okay. Sorry.
What are we talking about?
The heat pump.
The heat pump.
It's just,
Oh,
yeah, it just.
It moans
Were
like
those
the
all-
ghost in the big house.
Are you done with all your points?
I think so.
Okay, because I have a lot.
I figured you did. I didn't have anything to write them down with.
So first mention, make sure you don't forget to add a bullet point to mention State High growing up local.
Okay.
Next thing I would say, you mentioned a lot of your experiences. I think it's important to talk about which ones were unpaid or which ones you had to pay to have, because you had to probably pay to do the dig in
I did.
Bulgaria.
But there were scholarship opportunities for people, but
yeah,
I didn't.
But it's
use
important to mention that.
You have yours written down. Can I interject? Yeah. Would it be important to talk about Cambridge?
I don't think so.
Because that was kind of your first opening to some of the classes that you took at Cambridge College were.
Because I was still planning to go to Bucknell for biology.
Right.
Even though I took those classes in Cambridge, I was like, oh, these are just fun classes that I'm enjoying. And that was definitely an experience that most people wouldn't have gotten the opportunity to have. And I don't think it's relevant.
And then the second thing on a similar tangent is that you talked about taking Latin and your classics major related to history. You didn't really mention much about your study abroad in Greece.
Yeah, I was waiting for that.
And you had an opportunity in Greece that was pretty phenomenal because of a professor you had at Bucknell to go behind the scenes in the Agora. Mm-hmm. Not that these historic people would understand what that was because they're freshmen, but maybe they would. Mm-hmm. But, the concept of that's one of those things where you want to get in touch and get to know your professors. And that's just something to teach them.
Yeah.
To get to know your professors.
Detail.
You don't know what they're going to be able to provide for you.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So you wouldn't have to elaborate too much on it. You could just touch on that as like a detail of like how that can happen.
Right.
A connection that you can make or extend yourself.
And making these connections, I mean, as a kid myself, I was very opposed to taking connections.
Yeah.
I thought I needed to make it all by myself. Mm-hmm. But having connections and embracing the connections is one of those things that really makes your life so much better, so much fuller, and you get so much more out of. You get experiences that makes your life better.
Yeah, if that's good. If you can connect that somehow, I kind of like that.
Yeah, I appreciated how you mentioned about the internship that they were not hiring for.
Yes, that's right. And you just reached out.
Coming from a career services perspective, that is huge. Like to encourage them
to do that. Yeah.
Because sometimes it's not going to work out and they're going to say, no, we're not hiring for anything. Goodbye.
Which is okay. But that's okay.
Yeah. And that's okay too.
Yes.
But to reach out to areas that you are interested in, even if they might not have a job posting listed.
Yeah.
Because there may be something, they may work with you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
To create something.
Especially if you're willing to volunteer your time.
Yeah.
It's true.
Yeah.
And by the way, I've seen your wallet at CSIS and it's fantastic.
Oh, excellent. I didn't end up putting together most of it. I just put together the concept. Like, these are things that are available to you. Because I was only there for a month.
Well, it was one of the highlights of the opening night.
I went to opening night.
I know, but I don't think you realized it.
I didn't make it around the corner to where the wall was.
Yep.
There were too many people.
Yeah, sorry, Mike.
So also I was hoping we could get home soonish because I have to call my mom and get her my passport information still.
Got it.
So other thing, you focused a lot on, you were talking about this will happen in museums, which I'm not sure if that should be the focus of your talk, but it is kind of what you're here to discuss. So it's one of those, I don't know, just keep in mention of tone of what is important in respect to what you're doing versus what they care about.
I think that the whole point of me being there is to explain my position, my job, what it is that a museum professional does, how you can use your history degree for, like, in a museum, that kind of thing. I think that's kind of the point of why I'm there.
Okay, and other thing that you did not mention that I think is very important is talking about how your unpaid internship at the museum backdoored into a part-time job.
Right.
And I think that's very important.
Yeah.
You kind of just said, oh, I was interning and I was working, like, you didn't mention, oh, I was actually getting paid, and also how weird it was and that you had to, like, jump through hoops to get all of that.
How they originally, when they hired me, when they eventually were able to pay me, it wasn't for what I was doing.
Yeah, so just
Like-
make sure you mention that because that's important.
Yeah,
It is, yeah.
that you can, okay,
Yep.
yes.
Okay. Other thing that I think is very important to mention that you kind of discussed but didn't really make a big point of how little time there is to volunteer when you're working full time, especially when you have a 2-hour commute every day, plus 8 hours, plus getting ready to work, and just how exhausted you are at the end of the day.
Okay, but
'Cause one
what that brings a bit of reality to the situation, but how would I frame that in a way that would be helpful to them, besides just being realistic about how life is?
Because part of it is talking about how, like, hey, I had all these ambitious plans, and then when the reality set in of like, oh, because basically the main thing I wanted to get to that I point out later is mention network early, network often, get as much out of class work stuff you can get done, because anytime that you're applying for a job, they don't care like how you did it on an exam. They want to know what you're doing outside to show that like you're taking the initiative, and that of the 500 other people applying for your job, what makes you stand out.
Right. Yeah. I did completely forget to include the things that I wanted to say about networking.
That's good.
So there, mention that. I was also gonna, probably not worth it, but I just wrote a comment in here about talking about how exhausted you were, and also just throw in a joke about how awful the bridge on 270 is.
No, I don't think I need to do that.
Yeah.
It's awful though.
It's the only way in and out of Maryland and Virginia, like outside the city.
It's eight lanes, but you can't get through it.
So, other thing that you completely skipped over was any mention of the World War II exhibit and all the research you did for that.
I didn't do that much, to be honest. That was mostly Ken.
I know, but you still did some, and you could at least talk about that, and just, you're talking about history, so it's like, hey, here's literally history research
I
you
should
did for
at
the
least
university.
recommend that they go visit the World War
Yeah.
II exhibit.
There you go.
At the very least, it's only up until June, so.
I don't know if you're also, this may be a little more of a too depressing thing to mention. Mention that how your husband, who is a programmer, makes more money than your boss, the director at the museum, does. It's one of those, you kind of need to be realistic about all these kind of things.
I suppose, but I
feel
think that might be one of those questions that if they ask me how much money,
Yeah.
Well,
I
feel
will
like,
answer.
too, you
Yeah.
could make a comment about like that you do this work because you're passionate about it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's yeah. That
I
it's-
mean,
that it's
especially,
not, that it's not
I'm
for the
trying to
paycheck. I
decide
don't know how you
whether or
word
not
that,
I
but-
should include the fact that I'm still part-time 10 years later, and I haven't been
definitely
given a
mention that.
full-time position. That even though my boss would love for me to be full-time, and I would love for me to be full-time, that, you know, the athletics department hasn't deemed it necessary that I be full-time yet. And that is a fight that we are continuing to fight. So, yes, Mama.
But at the same time, you actually really enjoy the fact that you can say, no, I'm not going to be here this week.
Yeah, but
Yes, but I
Because
don't,
you are in a position where you can. Not everybody is.
yes, and I don't feel that that I should necessarily lean into that.
Yeah.
I think that I like the parts of my experience that I am fortunate to have experienced because I come from a wealthy background. I don't think is. I think it.
I think you're right.
That's why I mentioned that
Yes.
it's just like there are grants and there are scholarships for these kinds of things, but they are hard to get. They are you have to apply for them. You have to work for them. If you are of the if you have the opportunity to do these things, even if that means that you pay for them.
Yes.
You know, sometimes that's worth it. But I do understand that not everybody can do that. Not most people, in fact, cannot do that.
Right.
You know, it is the place of the privilege to be able to work for free.
Yeah. Amen.
So other things mentioned, I don't know if you want to mention this or not, but you kind of alluded to it, but you didn't make a big thing of that. You would not be able to be here without the support of your family during all of your gap times and when you're working internships, and you don't have to mention that you're living with family friends when you're in DC because you had a paying job, so you technically could have paid rent, but
And I did look for accommodations.
yeah, so it's
I
one
just
of
didn't
those
look hard.
mention that don't be afraid to lean on your support systems, whatever that might be, family, friends, any type of thing. Are you recording this or just?
She's been recording this the whole time.
Okay.
I'm not really sure why she's continued to record our discussion afterwards, but.
So you have a audio, video notes of.
Yeah, but I probably won't look at them before I need to give my presentation.
When is the presentation?
Tomorrow at 3:45.
Oh, okay.
It just worked tomorrow.
Yep. So we should go home so we can get a good night rest.
Mm-hmm. All right.